All right, everybody. Nice to meet you. My name is Catherine.
And my name is New.
My name is Preto.
I'm Melissa.
And my name is Ikra.
And today we're going to be discussing the language of food. So, let's start on how does perception and food related language vary around the world? So, etymology, it will vary around the world because obviously language is required for people to name food, to name things. And with languages, you can get through these barriers where you name a dish and then another language will adopt it and give it its own name. And so, for example, you see like for tea, half of the world calls it tea and half of the world calls it chai because the origins of the language have spread trade and with people making discussions. And so, you'll have people just making their own iterations of the name, depending on how isolated these groups are and how they give these foods their own monikers and etc. And so another thing to note about food and language and how people perceive it is how the consonants are placed for the word. So you'll have more frontal words like T's and K's and C's that use the front of your mouth. And the pitch of those words humans tend to psychologically see something that's higher pitched to seem smaller. So you'll hear words like cracker, you'll think something small, or you'll hear words with M's and N's and L's, and you'll think it's like big or creamy. And so like many people will keep this in mind when they name foods and companies where they make the word and the pitch of the sound, and people tend to perceive like if you were to name an ice cream Rocky Road, lots of like use the back of your throat to give it the perception of like something that's like big and creamy, as opposed to something like Cheez-It crackers, where you have a very high-pitched, small, you're expecting a zesty, quick, tiny meal in comparison. So, yeah. So, any questions?
Yeah, so I have a question about like the source. So how did you know that half of the world called tea chai and the other half calls it tea? And how did you know that was related back to trade? Was there some researcher, some sort of professional that presented that information, or did you do some research on your own?
I did see some research on our own, but also culturally, I come from Eastern Europe. And I found a lot of people from the Middle East and eastern parts of Europe call tea chai, while in the West, a lot of people say tea. And in Africa as well, West Africa, they will also call it chai. And so depending on these regions and how they might say the word, it might also show a lot of origin in trade, colonialism, many other things. Language similarities, assimilation in culture and food in these regions.
That was very helpful. Thank you very much. Have you heard of the researcher and linguist called Dan Jarofsky?
No, I have not.
Okay. Dan Jarofsky has done some work looking on exactly pretty much what you talked about, how the pronunciations of words related to food and the actual specific word choices that we select for foods can make them feel more or less desirable than they really would be without those words. And also going back to trade routes with China. So if you traded with China by land, you're more likely to call tea chai. Whereas if you trade by sea, you're more likely to call tea T with the letter T.
Mhm.
Um, and so that was a very, very interesting thing to me that you weren't exposed to Dangerosky, but you still came to the same conclusion given your background. So that was a very astute observation.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing. And
Absolutely.
and I want you to also know, um, all of you to know that if you want to use a whiteboard, there's also with the share content um, section in Collaborate Ultra, you can go over there and instead of sharing a file, you can actually share a blank whiteboard. And in that blank whiteboard, you could maybe write some of these words that you're talking about and let us know um, what you mean.
Mhm.
Okay, and so feel free to play around with the tools in here as well. And I'll get you back to the presentation, and you guys can continue.
Alrighty. Um, so um, we can go to the next subject then here. So, why are some cultures open to foods from various places while other cultures have strict dietary guidelines? So, um, so culturally, depending on how isolated these regions are or how strict these traditions may be, for example, you'll have many, for example, if you're of Muslim or if you are Jewish, you might abstain from eating pork or you might have specific ways of eating food, whether it be halal or kosher. So for some cultures, it may be integrated so much that without necessarily defying their groups or their traditions, they might not be able to as easily integrate other foods into their diet as much as, say, for example, just a regular American citizen that, you know, would enjoy eating food from any culture because they don't have necessarily any specific um, traditions or restrictions to food they can eat.
You also have the fact that some cultures have never been introduced to other foods, whereas in America we are very diverse. We have the availability and the knowledge to seek out different types of foods, whereas in some countries, some foods aren't available. When I was in Sri Lanka for 3 months, cheese was a novelty. Most Sri Lankans had never had cheese and didn't understand why I wanted cheese when I wanted cheese because it wasn't part of their diet.
And it can really be difficult when you come to trying new food because instinctually humans, when they try new things, it can be a bit apprehensive because it could be either dangerous or good. And people tend to be sometimes apprehensive in trying new things, and especially if they're thrown in an incredibly unfamiliar environment. For example, a lot of immigrants living here, it's very difficult to adapt and understand another culture, you know, all of a sudden, and then especially being exposed to such different foods, it can definitely be overwhelming and not used to what you were raised with.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Do you guys have you seen any like cross-pollination from essentially like one culture to the other with their language as it relates to food? So do you see the adoption of certain words and symbols into another language based on, how much they're interacting with a different culture and the food from that culture?
Well, as far as I'm aware of personally, I took 2 years of Japanese, and um, I've heard that Japan and Portugal were involved in trading, and the Japanese food for bread was pan, which is the word for bread in Portuguese. And for example, coming back to the discussion that I'm from Albania, a lot of foods that we have that are imported, we tend to like borrow those words. Like hamburger, we just say Hamburg, getting it from their culture. And I think many countries who do adopt food from other languages tend to just adopt the word from the language and country and culture that they have gotten it from.
If they don't have something that's already similar or it's based out of something that they already have inside of their own language.
Mhm.
Yeah, another example would be like, for example, with chapati, some Asian countries have adopted the word chapati, but basically it's from Swahili language, but the preparation, or rather the how you prepare it, and the name that was given a long time ago, it's hard to give it another name. So some Asian countries have adopted that name, and it's even in trade, like even in trade, they process it and they still call it the same thing. So that would basically be like uh, what you are saying, cross-pollination, like different cultures adopting different names that are originally not theirs.
And
Very interesting. Very interesting. Um, you know, Here, I guess we see a lot of in the state of Texas and in the southern regions of the United States, we see a lot of um, uh, South American and Central American influence, and with foods from those places. And so I think somebody mentioned that. That if there's not a word for that particular dish or that particular type of food in the native tongue, then they just adopt it. And I think we see that some here with like our Tex-Mex. I think we see that with like fajitas and enchiladas, right? We don't really have an English word for that, so we adopt the Spanish words for those, and we just incorporate them into English as if they were English. And so that's kind of interesting to me how languages are very fluid, and it's very it it's interesting to me if a closed culture would be as open to that flow of linguistic symbols to describe food. Have you guys run across any information about that?
um, not that we're aware of, but it would definitely be jarring if, your language is so different that there's no similarities in how the words are pronounced or anything like that, and to borrow a word like that. Or if it's something so unlike anything they've ever seen.
Yeah, okay. I imagine it might be, and I wonder if some cultures try to mask and hide um, their language from others, um, and if that has anything to do with their foods or the foods that they prepare. Um, did you guys come across anything maybe in that area as well?
No, not necessarily.
Okay. Yeah, so I was kind of I wonder, have you guys come across any of Mark Pagel's work? Mark Pagel did some work and looked at, cultures that are really close to one another, so like island populations of people, and they'll live in real close proximity, and so they're in very essentially kind of fierce competition for the resources on the island. And they'll do like subtle things like change the way in which they say certain words to kind of hide their motivations from others. And I'm just wondering if that has anything to do with food. And it may and may not. I'm just not sure, but it might be something that we could explore later.
Absolutely. I think maybe the reason why they could be doing that is because since globalization and cultures taking ideas from one another might be affecting their cultural identity and the fact that they want to remain unique and have these foods be within their cultural groups and not be open to other groups, that aren't with their culture or society.
It could also be the fact that in their language that sound is abnormal or difficult to do, and within the way that they normally speak, that they adapt it to their traditional way of speaking so that it does not feel abnormal.
Now, that's an interesting thought. So, in other words, you may have like certain grammatical rules within your native tongue, and just by introducing a word to describe a food from another language, or really any word, it could disrupt that flow or that sentence structure in some way. And so they rearrange the word or subtly reorganize it so that it flows. I want to go back, and I think it was Catherine who mentioned in Albanian they don't say the full word hamburger.
Mhm.
What was the word that they used to describe a
Hamburg-
hamburger?
Hamburger.
Hamburger.
Hamburger. It's like,
Okay. Okay. So you could tell my linguistic abilities, right? I have superb linguistic skills. But so does that different pronunciation and spelling allow that word to flow within the language of
abs-
Albanian?
absolutely. It would be a little bit jarring to pronounce it in a very American way when you have a language that's like meant to be very like quickly spoken. Like in Albanian, do you want to go eat a hamburger? A do me hunger Hamburg? You wouldn't say a do me hunger hamburger. It's a little off the tongue. It's not as easy to integrate into the language because it just doesn't fit. It's like a puzzle piece that doesn't fit.
Yeah, and you can hear that it doesn't fit too. It just doesn't sound right.
Mhm.
Very cool, very interesting. Well, thank you. I mean, that's all the questions I really have on this topic, so I appreciate it. Those were wonderful insights.
All right, so let's move on to the next topic then. So, why do language barriers disrupt food networks, and how might technological advances assist in establishing food networks? Well, hmm. So maybe some people, as they don't have the understanding of language that others may have because of different languages, they might have difficulty in asking for food or for help. And because of this, other people can't understand what their needs are because language establishes that link between different people. And so if you have a barrier between those two languages, you're not able to establish that help that you need. And for technological advances, I think definitely giving these people probably the ability to translate languages or, show an ability to translate these words somehow, like Google Translate is definitely, revolutionary for people to like instantaneously, like I could just pull up my phone and I could be in Italy and I'll, type down what I see and understand what it means for the most part. So I think technology can definitely help bridge those gaps and help people get a better level of understanding and help these people get food that they need.
Very cool. Can we go ahead and do some of that right now? So could we go to the whiteboard and present food, or at least the basic term for food in different languages? So let me see if I can shift us over to the whiteboard, and I'll go ahead, I'll lead off, and we'll go, let's see, where's my pencil? Let's see. Okay, so Bia,
Do we just type down food in different languages? The
yeah,
website?
that's what, yeah. So we can use Google Translate, and let's just present like 20 different words for food, and just mention the language that is, you know. So that's food. Oh, somebody's gonna take Spanish.
Ah, yes.
Ah, I was going for that one next.
I got
This is pretty good. This is a pretty good list.
So it definitely highlights the fact that like it varies so much for each language.
It's different.
Yeah.
So much different.
Like worlds apart.
Yeah.
And I think you also have to take in the fact that there are more than 8,000 languages around the world, and that trade happens all the time. And so while that happens, there's language that's being traded as well, like not just food or your materials or anything like that. So.
Yeah, okay. So elaborate a little bit more. So there's trade occurring. So is there sharing of these terms, or is there a lot of confusion? Oh, I see Portuguese is comida, just like Spanish. So they're kind of spoken in similar geographical regions of the world. So why not just consolidate that into one language?
I think though language has a lot of connection with culture, so that if these people were to integrate each other's languages, they would lose a bit of their culture along with it. And that language isn't just something, it's very connected to people from that region, Like we Americans and British people, we feel a connection because we speak the same language. So it's easier to establish connections as opposed to people who, for example, if you're Russian, you're not the same as a Serbian person. Your language might be similar, but there's differences that have to do with your culture and your ethnic background and origin. And so perhaps integrating other languages and assimilating them into your own completely would just remove the integrity of the culture connected with it.
Or if you take it another direction, both Spanish and Portuguese, if I remember right, I'm probably wrong, I think both originated from Latin and they both separated similarly but differently from each other. And so they came from the same root origin language, but they got used in different ways and got used by different people, different cultures, different dialects, different anything that while they're similar, they're still different.
Well, That I see where you're going with this, and I agree, but I'm kind of confused. Like, if language is about communicating with people, why would you want your language to be different from somebody else's?
Maybe they didn't want to communicate with those people at that time.
That's very interesting. That's very interesting. So even though they both have their origins in Latin, maybe at some point these people spread to different places. Maybe they were in competition with each other. Maybe they were just so far geographically from one another that there wasn't like any potential to really communicate. Is that kind of where you guys are going with this, or do you guys have another direction you wanna steer us?
I think geographically and historically that can definitely have to do a lot with the language. Sometimes people with a shared history, they want to specifically, like for example, when you're at home with your family, you have your own slang or terminology. And these people want to have a connection with people like them. So, for example, culturally, Spanish and Portuguese people are different. So, they've changed their languages so that they can communicate more with each other and have these relationships more established with people like them.
Interesting. And did you see that Bosnian and Croatian has it's the same word for food essentially. So I'm wondering if that's kind of a similar thing that occurred over there that occurred between like Portuguese and Spanish. So this is very interesting, and I've always kind of wondered if we were moving away from or toward um, one language, one universal language. I know there's been a lot of discussion about that and what that would mean for culture. And I also wonder what that means for in-group out-grouping, because I've always been concerned that in some ways culture will be lost if you lose all these languages. In other ways, I wonder if there'd be less in-group out-grouping. I really don't know. Do you guys have any ideas that you guys want to present on whether or not we're moving toward one language, or are we, moving toward more and a variety of different languages?
I think, unfortunately, because of globalization, English being one of the most commonly spoken languages, there are many languages, for example, in North America, when they integrated Native Americans, they essentially forced them to integrate into American culture. And many of these, for example, native languages have been going extinct, and not many people have been left speaking these languages because American settlers forced them to integrate. So I think possibly because of globalization, the world might slowly start to turn towards at least languages becoming more similar, borrowing more words with each other, or possibly even, unifying.
That's very interesting. Um, I I don't have anything else that I really want to discuss here. That's a fascinating list, and I'd love to see a more complete list of this. Is there a way to provide us with more languages and their term for food?
Absolutely. Here.
All right. And it doesn't have to be right now, but just maybe in an email, or is there somewhere where you could share that information with us?
Oh my goodness, I apologize.
That's
Um,
okay.
my computer disconnected when I put in the flash drive. I'm so sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Were you trying to
This one?
share it with
Okay.
us right now? That'd be great.
Yes. Okay. Where is it? Sorry.
It's gotta be, it's not PDF. Can I share a Word doc, or sorry, an Excel on this or no?
I don't know if an Excel will share very well. You might have to convert it to a PDF. Um, the PDF should share, but if you don't want to share it right now, we could always, if you could just direct me somewhere where you might be able to share and publish it. Um, I don't know. Do you guys have like any
We could
social
upload
media
it
where
to
you?
the weekly.
Okay. What about social media? Do you
We
guys
can
have?
perhaps email it.
Yeah, that would work. I could take it. I could accept that in an email. Do you guys have a social media page or anything?
I do
Like
have the social
like?
media page, but we don't have this document yet, though. I'm still
Oh,
waiting for them
okay.
to send it to me.
It's actually
Okay.
here. At least the words, not the video.
Well, I can look for it later in there. It'd be nice to see a more complete list of this because I mean, if you're going over to another place, I mean, the basic things that you might need to ask for is like, food, water, where do you use the bathroom? Those are like basic things. And so it'd be nice to see a list of all of these languages. This is really really fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
So we send
So
it
I
to
don't want to
you.
hold you guys up. I'll let
But
you guys get back to it.
Alrighty.
Okay.
Um, Here we go. So, define culturally appropriate food. So, um, according to eater.com, it is understood as food that corresponds to individual and collective consumer demand and preference in line with national and international law. So it has to be okay. It's understood as the food that corresponds to individual and collective consumer demand and preferences in line with national and international law. So this probably means it cannot be a food that is, for example, an endangered animal or something like, I'm not sure if cannibalism has any laws towards or against it, but it has to be a food that there's no laws that are specifically against prohibiting these foods.
Are you saying that cannibalism might be a culturally appropriate food?
No, it would be a culturally inappropriate food according to this definition because it is against law. It has to be something that is produced and consumed, and it has to be in line with national and international law.
And
So-
what if that national or international law isn't that cannibalism is accepted? I mean, who's to say that there's a culture out there that doesn't participate in cannibalism because within their culture that's appropriate?
That would be an interesting point. So I'm assuming then that the definition for culturally appropriate food keeps in consideration how others might perceive that food. So, for example, because of the definition saying that it has to be in guide with national and international law, there might be definitely like it would keep it would be definitely that these are not culturally appropriate because of the standards put in place. Or for example, if you're eating, for example, in Japan, they will have dolphins and they collect dolphin fins. And the problem is that many countries don't appreciate that because dolphins and sharks are going extinct. So shark fin soup, for example, may be considered to some groups that eat them culturally appropriate, but to others, because it is an endangered animal and it's at risk, it might not be culturally appropriate. So its beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
Okay, so essentially, if I were to say, let's say I go to Mexico and I need or Canada, and I would like to eat some food that is culturally appropriate. And let's say I'm not from the United States. Let's say I'm from um, Eastern Europe, and I go to Mexico or Canada, and I'm in Mexico or Canada, and let's say I eat a particular type of food that in that country is illegal, but in my country isn't. Um, should I be afforded the opportunity to eat my food from my culture, even if I can find and prepare it myself, or should I be supplied that by their government, or should I be just completely like obstructed from eating what I deem to be culturally appropriate? Or let's say I come from Japan and I want, shark fin soup. Um, can I catch sharks off the coast of Mexico and prepare those there? Um, why or why not?
Well, I guess it would be sort of disrespectful to their culture. And like you're going to other countries to try their food, not your own, so it would be disrespectful on behalf of them. So
So I think I'm kind of getting it. So if I'm in Japan and somebody from somewhere else comes to my place, I can eat the shark fin soup there, but I can't go to some other place and eat it.
Unless they also are okay with that occurring.
yeah, and
If there's no laws within that country that prohibit it, there's no reason why you cannot. But if there are laws in that country that do, you should respect those laws as a traveler into that country and not, you should not break that simply because it's something you want to do. You should respect it
And
instead.
try like adapt their culture instead of like changing.
And
Okay.
sometimes they don't have like the same resources as your own country does to prepare the food, and that has to be taken into consideration as well.
Okay, so maybe they don't have everything necessary to prepare your dish. That sounds like it's almost that is very applicable to our food pantries. So it might be that in the States we can grow certain types of foods really well here, but we can't offer all the foods from every place around the world. And we have a certain way of processing food. And so are you saying that when we're thinking culturally appropriate food to donate to the food banks, we don't necessarily have to be perfect in that we provide culturally appropriate foods for every culture and every possible dish. We just need to provide enough variety so that there is opportunity to prepare some culturally appropriate foods. Is that kind of where you
Yes.
guys are directing us? And could
Yeah.
you elaborate a little bit on that for us?
So, for example, if there's a dish that a certain group of people really want, well, maybe, there's not enough supply and demand to make that dish, but you can at least give them the ingredients so that they can themselves prepare the dish.
One of the other things that you can do particularly is spices tend to be capable of being transported many places and last a lot longer than fresh foods. And so rather than maybe being able to provide the specific fresh food. Maybe there are culturally appropriate spice that can be added to something different that makes it taste similar to what they're used to.
That's a very interesting idea. Yeah, so essentially, and I wonder if those spices would take up as much space in a food bank as the actual food. Probably not, right?
Correct.
And so you might have more space at the food bank. That's a really good thought. Yeah, so maybe providing spices rather and maybe flavors that taste like some of the culturally appropriate foods, but maybe not supplying all of that diversity, um, because maybe it's not practical or realistic. And then also the culturally appropriate part means it has to um, be in alignment with international and national law or international or national law.
I believe it is national and international law.
Okay, so it's both.
Yes.
Okay, very good. All right, I think I get it. Thank you.
All right, so let's go to the next topic then. What can be done to provide the food insecure and refuge populations with culturally appropriate foods? So definitely going back to that topic of providing them perhaps, not giving them the full exact thing, but the ingredients so that with their own means they can create it the way they want to.
Yeah, maybe a variety of ingredients. Like they can have a choice of what they usually, or rather, what is culturally acceptable to them. They can have a choice to choose from the ingredients if you provide a variety of them, and then they can prepare it in their own way or in their own, or rather, how they would like to prepare it.
About the contamination of foods with other foods. So, one of the things that I've noticed is you go into the store and let's say you want I don't know, a soup. And maybe that soup comes in a can, and oftentimes at like food banks, soups do come in cans. But sometimes it's difficult to find a soup that wasn't contaminated with maybe something that in your culture you might not eat. Um, do you guys have any solutions for that particular problem? So, for example, sometimes we'll sprinkle like meats or something else subtly into our like macaroni and cheese boxes or into our soups, and maybe some people can't eat those things. Are there any solutions to that particular problem?
Well, there's different ways you can approach it. One of them being, start from scratch. So if there aren't any soups available that you enjoy, then with those ingredients, you can make it the way you want to. Or what people can do, for example, is make, for example, like a clean slate. Like, for example, for macaroni and cheese, if somebody puts pork on it, then obviously some people can't eat it. So instead of putting those tiny seasonings or ingredients, you can leave it to the purchaser to do that. And perhaps like, or more varieties and flavors. Or like, for example, if you only eat a certain type of macaroni and another culture puts stuff on it, then just get the pasta so that you can use it to make it into the macaroni you want. Or they have different like flavors and forms so that, you're not only just stuck with one option.
Kind of like separate everything, right? And then make it optional to include those things back in. So maybe like little packets or something um, could be the solution. Is that kind of where you're going?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think that I could see that because there are times when like I get a soup or something and I'm like I just I don't want some of that stuff in there. And I can imagine that that would be even worse for somebody that, according to their religious restrictions or dietary restrictions or cultural norms, that it could almost be taboo um, to eat certain types of foods that were just pre-mixed in. And so then you go down, I don't know, to like a food pantry or a food bank, and you're expecting to get help and some food, and you look around and there's nothing that you can really eat because everything's been, contaminated with something that you're not permitted to have. This sounds like a lot of work, actually, for people and staff at food banks. How could they manage to s- to have enough manpower to have the oversight and do the research into the backgrounds of all the people that they serve? Like, do you guys have any ideas or solutions for them?
I mean, definitely though, for example, like if Campbell's soup doesn't have any soups that may be culturally appropriate, perhaps, bringing it in light of these companies so that they're able to serve to a more wider variety of consumers, or, um, you know, trying to find people that can find, or for example, another really good thing for communities of certain groups is like ethnic food stores. Like for example, again, my family being from Albania, we like Albanian food. So we go to the Arabic market and we buy foods that are very similar to ones from our home. So we get like traditional foods from these markets and communities. Or you'll have a store like an Asian market that has a variety of foods from different countries in Asia, and maybe getting food from these places or getting in touch with these communities can help bridge those gaps so people can get food that isn't contaminated for them to eat.
Something else that they could maybe consider is maybe working with a grocery store to get particular things, or even to do some type of like coupon system where if I can't have pork, then maybe since they don't have chicken today, maybe I can get a coupon from that grocery store that says I'm allowed to get a pound of chicken rather than the pork that was available at the food pantry that day. I mean, you can always try to do something like that, get some type of relationship going with a local grocery store that would be interested in helping to contribute.
Well, I think all of those ideas are interesting solutions that you know might work really well. Getting Campbell's involved or anybody else that's donating, and maybe reaching out to those different vendors and the different restaurants or markets. All of that would be very good. Um, I still wonder how a nonprofit that is so oftentimes understaffed can do all of that work. That sounds like a lot of hard legwork. I would be interested to know, um, does City Square have to do all this work on their own? Does, Vickery Meadow need to do all of this background research on who they serve all on their own? Or do they have other people helping them? And if so, I wonder how we could help, if we could help them do some of that background, because we do have access to a very diverse population here at Richland. So I wonder if if we could do some of that legwork for them, and maybe that's already been done, and maybe that's something that we could check into. Um, Ikra, do you mind writing that down for us so that we can maybe check into that, and see about the markets and see about how exactly they research the
Okay.
culturally appropriate needs of the people in the community? It just sounds very challenging to me.
I think definitely if you have volunteers, or for example, if you have these communities where, for example, um, you're from Mexico and you're having a hard time finding Mexican food, well, if there's a Mexican community or volunteers from Mexico, for example, they can, if you connect with those cultural groups, you can help, or volunteers or communities, or for example, like you can do little events or festivals where you can fundraise for food. Like, for example, the Greek Food Festival is very interesting. And if, for example, these cultural groups could do the same, where they can do a festival or something and fundraise money, or, give food to these people that need it, perhaps it would help them greatly.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. When you go to the Greek Food Festival, are any of the food pantries there?
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, see, I've gone down to the Irish festival, and they've got all different types of traditional dishes from there, right? Stovach and stew, and and all that. But yeah, I don't recall ever seeing the food pantries or anything down there, and I'm wondering if there's an opportunity to form some connections there. So that's a really good thought, Catherine. Um, Ikra, do you mind writing that down for us too? Maybe
Yeah,
looking at these various festivals and
I,
seeing, yeah, that's awesome. Okay, I don't want to hold us up anymore. We're starting to get short on time. Do we still have another topic to discuss?
Absolutely. All right. So, how might food insecurity and language relate? Well, definitely if you are of an isolated region and your language isn't very well spoken by other people, or you have difficulty speaking their language, it can definitely contribute if you're an isolated community and you're in need of food and you can't access it.
So are you saying like if you are a refugee coming from a country with a language that, is very rare, it could potentially be very difficult for you to find food um in in the new place?
Yeah, it can be very difficult for them to adapt, and that in itself can be a factor that would push them into more food insecurity. For example, if you're put into a new country, if you're going to have to make money, you have to work, but that means you're going to have to probably know the language or at least understand something. So, not knowing the language can definitely be a big hoop for you to jump over to, for example, get help that you need, or get on the right foot in a newer country, or yeah.
Yeah, I almost feel like we need we need like a universal survivor's guide or something, Like like here are the basic things that you need to know how to say, or at least be able to point to, right? Almost like a Rosetta Stone, and maybe that is Google Translate. Maybe that is some technology that we can provide. But if they're coming from such remote places, do they are they even familiar with the technology? What if in that culture there's a taboo connected to the technology itself? Like these are very big challenges. I'm not sure that I have any solutions for these questions I'm presenting. But if you guys wanna chime in, go for it.
Well, for example, regions, for example, if it's not culturally unacceptable to use technology, it would definitely be helpful if in those regions you can access them with, for example, technological devices, and integrate education to help them learn how to use these things. And it can definitely help people living in these regions as they learn new skills that can help aid them in the future, especially involving food and learning about another culture to help with those problems of theirs.
Very cool.
Well,
Anybody else? New, Beto, anybody?
I can add, for example, in most African countries, most of the westernization that is going on in there is was probably, or rather started with the missionaries. Like for example, church missionaries and many other missionaries came to Africa, introduced the Western culture, and slowly by slowly, you find most African countries starting to adopt more and more Western, or rather more and more Western ideologies. And nowadays, you can find even more, like for example, in the education center, or rather in education, a lot has been integrated that is Western. So I can say maybe if people were to be, or rather, if people were to be introduced to some other cultures or ideologies from other places, there is a chance that they may accept it, and if they don't accept it, maybe there's something else they can accept that is rather acceptable to them.
Okay. Um, Beto, is that cultural intrusion? I'm not really sure what word we should use. Blending, cultural blending. Um, is that perceived as in a positive light? Like, is that perceived to be helpful, something that people want, or is it perceived to be in a negative light and that people don't really want to be westernized or feel as though Western cultures are imposing? Um, how is it generally perceived?
I'll probably put it more towards individuality. Like as time goes by, different individuals have different perceptions towards different ideas. Like although part of it is also community based. So different areas in, for example, in a culture or different locations with the different people, they may accept a certain idea or they may not accept a certain idea. And you may find some areas in which a certain community as a whole may not even be open to any ideas. So I would say it may or may not be individualistic, and it also may be community based. So maybe there should be some guidelines to how you approach different areas of communities or cultures.
Oh, that's a very wise insight. I wonder if the UN has any of those guidelines. I don't know if they do. It would make sense to me that they would, but I mean that's a really good insight. In that when you go into a new place, you can't just assume that they want you there, right?
Yeah.
You kind of have to tread lightly, so to speak, and ask questions and be cautious of how you help and how helping might be perceived. Um, that's very good. I appreciate all of the work that you guys did to prepare this conversation. Do we have any other topics that you guys are wanting to discuss with us, or are you ready to conclude?
Yeah. Okay, so how does the staff in our food pantry at Richland College provide non-English speaking peoples with food? Um, well, one of the easiest ways is if you don't have translators or peoples within those communities, at least presenting the food to them or presenting the opportunity for them to get that food would be helpful.
Another way of helping them would be having volunteers that speak different languages, like Spanish or Vietnamese or something like that, and they can help with that.
It might be like print out like some pictures of like the food that you're gonna provide them, and then so like if they look at it, they understand. So you don't have to like do the Google Translate if there's not one present at the moment.
And another good thing is symbolism is kind of universal. So pictures are definitely helpful because, you know, most people can have very similar ways of visually perceiving things. So if you show these symbols, it can definitely, you know, help.
Yeah, so you're basically saying that if they can't speak the language and they don't know how to ask for food in English, they can make gestures and they can point if there are visual representations of the food like on a wall or on a billboard or on a poster, they could walk up to it and like point and then gesture to their mouth or something, essentially giving you the idea that they need food, right?
Absolutely. And that in itself, you know, is a form of communication, much like language, and can be just as an effective tool. Maybe not as effective because you're not conveying the exact idea, but it definitely gets somewhere.
Yeah, okay. I see where you're going with that. Um, Thank you all very much for joining us today. The students have really done a lot of hard work on preparing these online outreach forums for us. Just a little background about how this particular week has gone in the Metroplex. It's been kind of a rough week for a lot of people in the Metroplex. Um, we had tornadoes come through, and even if people weren't directly affected, they were indirectly affected, and operations here at the school were. And we still have people in our immediate surrounding area that are in our thoughts and minds and prayers. And so just be thoughtful of them. There are people right now that have been dislocated and relocated, and they're looking for food, and they're looking for housing, and they're looking to secure those basic needs for themselves, and they're really concerned about how the future might be for them. So here are some resources for those people that might be in need. And if you know anybody that is in need, please direct them to some of our community partners that have provided us excellent background information into their services. City Square just about has a full range of services for those people that are impoverished or in need. Vickery Meadow Food Pantry provides many different types of foods to people in the area that are in need. Mosaic Family Services also offers some counseling types of services to people who might need those as well, and serves refugee populations. And then our Learning Center has partnered with us to put us into contact with these different agencies. So we really appreciate the work and the opportunity that we have to serve and to learn from the various staff and volunteers at these different places. And we hope if you are not in need of any of these services, please reach out to other people and inform them that these services are there. And once again, this is by no means an exhaustive list of all of the services offered in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. You can certainly contact the Learning Center and get a more complete list, or find a more complete list on Dallas County Community College District's website. So we really appreciate you all being here today. And if you are looking for service learning credit, it is there and available to you. You can earn up to an hour and a half of service learning credit for attending this this service learning outreach forum. So what you'll need to do is you'll need to have attended this event. We will have a recording of this event up in the next week, but really need to be here live for the entire event, and then contact Tanisha Taylor at dccd.edu within 24 hours requesting feedback questions. You'll answer those questions and then respond thoughtfully to each one of those questions, and then submit those back to our Learning Center within a week of this event. So once again, we appreciate everybody for joining us today. Students, do you have anything else you want to say to our audience?
No, but thank you for having us.
All right. Thank you guys for joining me today. You guys did a wonderful job. I'll see you next week.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.